2 weeks ago, I was dying to get pregnant. Now I'm praying for a negative test. My husband and I had been trying to have a baby for 3 years with no success, and it was destroying me from the inside out. Every month I'd take a test and see that single line mocking me, and every month I'd cry in the bathroom while he held me and promised we'd keep trying. We'd spent our entire savings on our first round of IVF, and 2 weeks before they'd transferred the embryo into my body. Now I was in the waiting period before I could take a pregnancy test, and every day was torture. I Googled every possible symptom, analyzed every twinge in my body, and drove myself crazy wondering if it had worked. My younger sister Katie had been my rock through all of this. She came over with ice cream when I cried and held my hand during the embryo transfer. Katie was single and focused on her career, always said she didn't want kids, which made her the perfect safe person to talk to. We'd gotten closer in the past few months than we'd ever been in our whole lives. Katie called me one evening and asked if she could come over, and her voice sounded really strange. When she arrived, she was crying and could barely get the words out. "I'm pregnant," she finally said, and my whole world tilted sideways. My sister was single, this obviously wasn't planned, and she kept saying, "I'm so sorry," over and over like she'd done something terrible. I forced myself to hug her and tell her everything would be okay, even though I felt like someone was squeezing my heart in their fist. Here I was, spending thousands of dollars and pumping my body full of hormones just for a chance at a baby, and my sister got pregnant by accident. My husband came into the room and put his arm around Katie's shoulders, telling her we'd help with whatever she needed. "You're going to be an amazing mom," he said, and Katie burst into tears again. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on getting through the 2-week wait without losing my mind. Katie texted me every day asking how I was feeling, if I'd noticed any signs of pregnancy. My husband brought me my favorite foods and rubbed my feet at night while we watched TV. Everything felt normal except for the constant anxiety eating away at my stomach. Then one afternoon, I came home early from a doctor's appointment because they had a cancellation and finished sooner than expected. My husband's car was in the driveway when it shouldn't have been there. I figured he'd come home for lunch and walked into our bedroom to surprise him. My husband and Katie were in my bed, and for a second my brain couldn't even process what I was seeing. They scrambled apart, grabbing sheets, and Katie was crying and saying my name over and over. I just stood there while my husband started putting on his pants, not even looking at me. "How long?" I finally asked, and my voice didn't even sound like mine. Katie couldn't speak, just kept sobbing, so my husband answered. 4 months, he said, like he was telling me what time it was. 4 months. The entire time I was going through IVF. The injections, the ultrasounds, the embryo transfer, he was sleeping with my sister. "The baby is yours?" I asked Katie, and she nodded. My husband got her pregnant while I was paying thousands of dollars to try to have his baby. "Get out," I said quietly. My husband actually rolled his eyes. "Don't be dramatic. We need to talk about this like adults." That's when something inside me snapped. "You were inside my sister while I was sticking needles in my stomach for you," I screamed. "Every single day I was injecting myself with hormones, making myself sick, hoping and praying, and you were with her." Katie tried to touch my arm. "It just happened. We didn't mean for it to." I shoved her hand away. "You watched me cry about being infertile while you were carrying his baby. You held my hand during the transfer." My husband grabbed his shirt and had the nerve to look annoyed. "You're acting insane right now. Katie and I have something real. You've been obsessed with getting pregnant for years. That's all you care about." I threw his phone at his head and screamed at them both to get out of my house. Katie kept banging on the locked door begging to explain, but I couldn't hear it anymore. 2 days later, I was supposed to take my pregnancy test. I sat on the bathroom floor with the stick in my hand, not even wanting to look. When I finally did, there were 2 lines. After 3 years of negatives, of grief, of feeling broken, I was pregnant. I held the positive test and felt absolutely nothing except trapped. I'd wanted this so badly I would have given anything, done anything. And now I was having a baby with the man who destroyed me. A baby I didn't want. I picked up my phone. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever, my thumb hovering over different names in my contacts. My mom would tell me to calm down and think rationally. My dad would want to fix everything immediately. Katie's name was right there, and I felt sick looking at it. The person I would normally call with news like this, good or bad, was my husband, and that thought made me want to scream. My hand was shaking, so hard I could barely hold the phone. I scrolled to Haley's name, my best friend from college, and pressed call before I could change my mind. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy and confused because it was almost 1 in the morning. I tried to say hello, but nothing came out except this horrible choking sound. Haley's voice went sharp and awake immediately, asking what was wrong, if I was hurt, where I was. I managed to get out that I needed her, that something happened, and I couldn't stop crying long enough to explain anything else. She told me she was coming right now and to stay on the phone with her. I could hear her moving around, probably getting dressed, telling Christopher something in the background. She kept talking to me the whole time, asking yes or no questions because I couldn't form real words. Was I at home? Yes. Was I safe? I didn't know how to answer that. Was I alone? Not anymore, because my husband was somewhere in this house. Haley said she was in the car and would be there in 20 minutes, and I just kept crying and holding that positive test in my other hand. Haley got to my house in 40 minutes, even though she lives across town, and I heard her banging on the front door. I couldn't make myself get up off the bathroom floor, so I just sat there until I heard her calling my name through the house. She found me exactly where I'd been since I took the test, still holding it, my face probably a mess from crying. Haley took one look at me and dropped down on the floor next to me, pulling me into a hug. She asked what happened, and I couldn't get the words out in any kind of order. I told her about coming home early, about finding them in my bed, about Katie being pregnant. I told her it had been going on for 4 months, the entire time I was doing IVF. Every injection, an appointment, and ultrasound. Haley's face went completely white and then red, and she said something I'd never heard her say before about my husband. I showed her the positive pregnancy test and watched her try to process everything at once. She asked if I was sure about the test, and I nodded, because those 2 lines were clear as anything. Haley stood up and pulled me to my feet, telling me I couldn't stay here tonight, that we needed to get me out of this house right now. We went to my bedroom and Haley started throwing my clothes into a suitcase, not even folding anything, just grabbing whatever she could reach from my closet and drawers. I stood there kind of useless, watching her pack my life up, and then we heard footsteps in the hallway. My husband started pounding on the bedroom door, saying we needed to talk about this like adults. His voice sounded annoyed, like I was being unreasonable. Haley marched over to the door and yelled at him to go away, that I didn't want to talk to him. He kept insisting, saying I was being dramatic and irrational, and Haley told him she would call the police if he didn't leave me alone right now. I heard him kick the door and say something nasty, and then his footsteps going back down the hallway. Haley grabbed my suitcase and my purse and my phone, checking to make sure I had my wallet and keys. She took my hand and we basically ran out of that house, and I didn't look back at anything. The guest room at Haley's house was small and painted light blue, and I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling for hours without sleeping. The positive pregnancy test was in my pocket because I couldn't make myself put it down, and it felt like it weighed more than anything else in the world. My hand kept going to my stomach even though there was nothing to feel yet, nothing to show that anything was different. 3 years of wanting this baby, of crying over negative tests, of spending every dollar we had on one chance. And now it worked. The IVF actually worked, and I was pregnant with the baby I'd dreamed about constantly, except I didn't want it anymore. The thought of being connected to my husband for the rest of my life, of co-parenting with him, of watching him be with Katie while I raised his child alone, made me feel trapped in a way I'd never felt before. I'd wanted this so badly I would have done anything, sacrificed anything, and now it felt like a punishment instead of a blessing. The baby I'd prayed for was growing inside me, and all I felt was angry and numb and completely trapped. My phone started ringing at 7 in the morning and didn't stop. Katie's name kept flashing on the screen over and over, and I watched it ring without answering. She left voicemail after voicemail, and I could see the notifications piling up. By the end of the second day, she'd called 37 times. I finally listened to one of the messages and immediately wished I hadn't. Katie was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her, saying she loved me and never meant to hurt me, that she was so sorry and needed to explain. She said they didn't plan this, like that made any difference at all. I threw my phone across Haley's living room as hard as I could, and it hit the wall, the screen cracking in a spiderweb pattern. Haley came running in from the kitchen and found me standing there shaking, and she picked up my broken phone without saying anything. She made me sit down on the couch and brought me water and just sat next to me while I cried again. On day 3, my husband showed up at Haley's front door with flowers. Actual flowers like this was some normal relationship problem. I watched through the window as he knocked and waited, holding this big bouquet of roses. Haley answered the door, and I could hear him from inside, saying he needed to talk to me, that people make mistakes and our marriage was worth fighting for. His voice sounded so reasonable and calm, like he was the rational one and I was overreacting. I walked to the door and looked at him through the screen, and I told him he could work through raising his baby with my sister while I figured out what to do with mine. His face changed when I said that, and he started to push past Haley. Christopher appeared from somewhere behind me and physically stepped between my husband and the door, and he's a big guy who played football in college. My husband looked at Christopher and then back at me, and he dropped the flowers on the porch and left. Christopher stayed at the door until my husband's car was gone, and then he picked up the roses and threw them in the garbage can outside. I called the fertility clinic on Monday morning and asked for an appointment as soon as possible. The nurse who answered recognized my name and said she was so happy to hear from me, asking if I'd tested yet. I told her yes, it was positive, and she started congratulating me before I could say anything else. I had to interrupt her and say I needed to talk to someone about my options, and my voice broke on the word options. She went quiet for a second and then said she understood and she could get me in that afternoon. I thanked her and hung up, and then I sat on Haley's bathroom floor and cried so hard I couldn't breathe. Haley found me there and held me, and she didn't try to tell me what to do, or that everything would be okay. She just held me while I fell apart. Aisha met me in her office instead of an exam room, and she sat down across from me and asked how I was doing. I must have looked terrible because her face got really concerned really fast. She asked what was going on, and I told her the basic facts about walking in on my husband and Katie, about the affair during my IVF cycle, about Katie being pregnant too. Aisha listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a minute. Then she explained that I had time to make decisions, that I didn't have to choose anything today, but I needed to start taking care of myself regardless of what I ultimately decided. She asked if I was safe where I was staying and if I had support, and I told her about Haley. Aisha said she wanted me to come back in a week for a checkup and that we'd go from there. She was gentle and didn't push me, but I could see in her eyes that she knew this was bad. Before I left, Aisha handed me a paper with 3 names and phone numbers on it. She said they were therapists who worked with women dealing with trauma and complicated pregnancies, and she really thought I should call one of them. She reached across the desk and held my hand, and I started crying again because I was so tired of crying. I told her I wanted this baby so much, and now I didn't know what I wanted, and it felt like I was losing my mind. Aisha squeezed my hand and said there was no right answer here, that whatever I decided would be valid and I had support either way. That somehow made it worse because I wanted someone to just tell me what to do, to make this choice for me so I didn't have to carry it. But she couldn't do that, and I knew it. I took the paper with the therapist names and left her office, and Haley was waiting in the parking lot. Davina's office was in a small building near downtown, and Haley drove me there 3 days later for my first appointment. The waiting room was quiet and had comfortable chairs and plants everywhere, and I filled out a bunch of paperwork about my medical history and mental health. When Davina called me back, she was younger than I expected, maybe in her late 30s, with kind eyes. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started talking and couldn't stop. I told her everything from the beginning, about the 3 years of trying and the IVF and finding them together and the positive test. I cried through most of it, going through half a box of tissues on her desk. Davina didn't try to fix anything or offer solutions or tell me what I should do. She just listened and nodded and said things like, "That sounds impossible and I'm so sorry you're going through this." When the session was over, I felt exhausted but maybe slightly less alone. She scheduled me for twice a week and said we'd work through this together, whatever I decided. I left her office and got back in Haley's car, and I realized this was my life now, trying to figure out how to survive something I never thought I'd have to survive. That night, my phone rang while I was lying in Haley's guest bed staring at the ceiling. I saw it was my mom calling and my stomach dropped because I knew Katie must have told them. I answered and heard my mom crying before she even said hello. She kept saying she didn't understand how this happened to our family, like it was some natural disaster instead of Katie and my husband choosing to destroy me. My dad took the phone and asked what I needed from them, his voice careful and quiet. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I had no idea what to say, because what I needed was for the past 4 months to not have happened, for Katie to not be a liar, for my husband to not be who he actually was. I told my dad I didn't know, and he said okay, that he loved me, and we hung up. The next morning, Christopher drove me back to my house to get more of my belongings while my husband was at work. Haley had texted him to make sure the coast was clear, and Christopher came with me because nobody trusted my husband not to show up. Walking into our bedroom made my stomach turn over, and I had to stop in the doorway and breathe for a minute. Christopher put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't. I started throwing clothes into garbage bags as fast as I could, grabbing important documents from the filing cabinet, unplugging my laptop. I was reaching for my jewelry box on the dresser when I saw Katie's hair tie on my nightstand, just sitting there next to the lamp like it belonged. My sister had been in my bed, in my house, with my husband, and she left her hair tie behind like trash. I picked it up and threw it across the room, and Christopher didn't say anything, just kept helping me pack. 2 days later, I was brushing my teeth at Haley's house when I got an alert on my phone that our joint bank account balance was low. I logged in and saw my husband had transferred almost everything out, leaving exactly $500. I called him immediately, screaming into the phone that he couldn't just steal our money. He said calmly that he needed to support Katie and their baby now, that I should understand he had responsibilities. I hung up and called Julian Moody, the divorce lawyer Haley had recommended. Julian listened to everything and then said very clearly that what my husband did was financial abuse, and we were filing emergency motions immediately to freeze assets and get me temporary support. He told me to document everything, save every text and email, and not to engage with my husband directly anymore. That same afternoon, Katie showed up at Haley's house. I heard her voice through the door, sobbing and begging to talk to me. Haley was telling her to leave, but I walked to the door and told Haley to let her in. Haley looked at me like I was crazy, but she stepped aside and Katie came in with her face all red and puffy from crying. I stood there looking at my sister and felt nothing except cold anger. I told her that she held my hand during my embryo transfer while she was carrying his baby. I told her she watched me inject hormones into my stomach every single day while she was sleeping with my husband. I told her I would never forgive her for as long as I lived. Katie started trying to explain, saying they fell in love and didn't mean for it to happen. She said she felt terrible, but she couldn't stop herself, like she was the victim in this situation. I actually laughed in her face because love doesn't make you betray your sister during the hardest time of her life. Love doesn't make you lie every single day while watching someone suffer. Katie kept crying and saying I didn't understand, but I told her to get out. She left, and I felt this cold satisfaction that she was hurting too, even though I knew it wasn't enough and would never be enough. 3 weeks later, I was 6 weeks pregnant and sitting in Davina's office for our regular session. She asked me directly what I wanted to do about this baby. I had been avoiding the question for weeks, but she wasn't letting me dodge it anymore. I finally said out loud that I didn't want to be connected to my husband for the rest of my life. The words felt like giving up on everything I wanted for 3 years, but they also felt true in a way that made my chest hurt. Davina nodded and asked if I wanted her to help me think through next steps. I told her I needed to talk to Aisha first. I met with Aisha 2 days later and she explained the process for termination, the timeline I was working with. She was gentle but really clear that I needed to decide soon if that was the path I was choosing. She talked about the medical procedure, what to expect, how long recovery would take. I scheduled a follow-up appointment for 1 week out to give myself time to be absolutely certain, because this decision was permanent and I couldn't take it back. I left her office feeling like I was moving underwater, everything slow and heavy. That night, Julian called and said he needed to warn me about something. My husband's lawyer, Tucker Langley, had sent papers trying to claim I was mentally unstable and shouldn't make medical decisions right now. Julian said it was a transparent attempt to force me to continue the pregnancy, to take away my choice about my own body. The audacity of my husband trying to control me after what he did made me so angry I couldn't see straight. I went into Haley's guest room and punched the wall hard enough to put a hole in the drywall. My hand hurt, but I didn't care. Haley came running and found me sitting on the floor shaking, and she sat down next to me without saying anything. Julian filed for an emergency restraining order and temporary support, and 2 weeks later we had to go to court. I sat in the courtroom waiting for the judge, and then my husband walked in with Tucker. It was the first time I'd seen him since I left, and he stared at me across the room like I was the one who did something wrong. The judge called the case, and Julian presented all the evidence of the affair, the financial abuse, the controlling behavior. Tucker tried to argue that I was emotional and making rash decisions, but Julian shut that down fast. The judge ordered my husband to stay away from me, to restore half the money he took, and granted a temporary restraining order. My husband's face went red and he tried to argue, but the judge told him to be quiet. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. That night, my mom called. She asked me not to do anything rash about the pregnancy, and I realized she was talking about termination, like it was some impulsive choice instead of the most terrible decision of my entire life. I told her this was my body and my choice, and she needed to support me or leave me alone. She started crying about losing a grandchild, and I hung up on her because I couldn't listen to her make this about herself when I was the one who had to live with whatever I decided. The next day, a message popped up on my phone from someone named Serenity Nelson. She said she used to be Katie's roommate and had information I needed to know. I stared at the message for 10 minutes trying to decide if I wanted to hear anything else about my sister's life, but something made me agree to meet her for coffee. We met at a place downtown 2 days later, and Serenity was nervous, twisting her coffee cup between her hands. She told me the affair didn't start 4 months ago like my husband said. It started 5 months ago, which meant Katie was sleeping with him before my IVF cycle even began, before the injections, before the embryo transfer, before any of it. They were together when I was making the decision to spend our savings on treatment. Serenity kept apologizing for not telling me sooner, but she didn't know I existed until Katie posted something about family drama on social media. I sat there feeling cold all over because this meant everything was even worse than I thought. Then Serenity pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of text messages Katie had sent her. My sister was bragging about the affair, saying my husband was amazing and she'd never felt this way before. In one message, Katie called me obsessed with getting pregnant and said I was exhausting to be around. Another message said I was so focused on having a baby that I didn't even notice my own husband was unhappy. I read my sister's words about me while she was betraying me, and my stomach twisted. I shoved back from the table and ran to the bathroom where I threw up in the toilet. My hands shook while I gripped the porcelain, and my whole body felt like it was rejecting everything I'd just learned. When I came out, Serenity was waiting by the door looking guilty. She said she was sorry for showing me, but I deserved to know the truth about what kind of person my sister really was. I thanked her and left the coffee shop, then sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. Back at Haley's house, I forwarded all the screenshots to Julian. He called me an hour later and said this evidence was perfect for establishing my husband's pattern of lying and would make the divorce case much stronger. Then he asked again about my pregnancy plans because it affected the timeline for everything. I told him I had an appointment scheduled for next week to terminate, and I wanted this marriage over as fast as the law allowed. Julian said he'd push for the fastest possible dissolution, and we'd use every piece of evidence we had. That night, I lay in Haley's guest room with my hand on my stomach. Tomorrow was the appointment, and I kept crying because I wanted this baby so much for 3 years. Every month of negative tests, every injection, every ultrasound, every desperate prayer, it all led to this pregnancy that I was about to end. Haley came in and sat on the bed next to me. She didn't try to talk me out of it or tell me everything would be okay. She just held my hand while I cried and grieved for what I was losing. I barely slept that night. The clinic the next morning was clean and quiet. The nurse took me back to a room and explained what would happen. The procedure itself took less than 15 minutes and didn't hurt as much as I expected, but afterward I lay in the recovery room feeling completely empty. Not just physically, but in every way a person can feel hollow. Aisha came in to check on me and squeezed my hand. I told her thank you for helping me, even though this wasn't the outcome either of us wanted when we started IVF. She said she understood, and that I was making the choice that was right for me. I went home with Haley and spent the next week mostly in bed. The physical recovery was manageable, but the emotional devastation was crushing. I couldn't make myself get up most days. Haley brought me food and water and didn't push me to do anything except take care of myself. Davina called every day for phone sessions because I couldn't leave the house. She helped me understand that I was grieving multiple losses at once. The baby, my marriage, my sister, my family, the future I'd imagined, all of it gone. Some days I could barely talk during our sessions, and she just stayed on the phone with me so I wasn't alone. My dad showed up at Haley's house 8 days after the procedure. My mom wasn't with him. He sat down in the living room and told me he supported my decision, even though it was hard for him to think about. He said he was ashamed of Katie and my husband for what they did to me. Then my dad started crying and apologizing for not protecting me from this pain. It was the first time since everything started that someone from my family actually made me feel supported instead of judged. We sat together for 2 hours, and he didn't try to fix anything or make excuses for Katie. He just listened and told me he loved me and he was sorry. After he left, I felt a tiny bit less alone in the world. 2 days later, an email from Katie showed up in my inbox. She wrote that she'd had a miscarriage and lost the baby. The whole email was about how we were both suffering now and going through the same loss, so maybe I could understand and forgive her. She made it sound like losing her affair baby was the same as me terminating my wanted pregnancy because of their betrayal. I forwarded the email to Julian without responding because I had nothing to say to her. When I showed Haley, she pointed out that Katie had managed to make my medical crisis about herself even in her supposed apology. That afternoon, my husband showed up at Haley's front door. I heard his voice through the woods saying we'd both lost babies now and should support each other through this grief. He actually thought Katie's miscarriage was a reason for us to get back together. I walked up to the door and told him he lost his affair baby, while I lost my wanted baby because of his betrayal, and those things were not remotely the same. He kept talking, but I walked away and let him stand there yelling at the closed door until he finally left. Julian called the next week and said he was pushing hard for a fast settlement. My husband's lawyer tried to drag things out, but the evidence of the affair and financial abuse was overwhelming. Julian said Tucker was advising my husband to settle because going to court would be worse for him. We agreed to mediation to avoid a long battle. 3 weeks later, I sat across a table from my husband in a mediator's office. He wouldn't look at me, and I felt nothing when I saw his face. We spent 4 hours negotiating the end of our marriage while a neutral third party took notes and kept us from screaming at each other. By the end, we had an agreement to move forward with the divorce. The next mediation session happened 2 weeks later, and my husband showed up with a list of demands that made Julian's jaw actually drop. My husband's lawyer, Tucker, started by saying his client deserved spousal support because my obsession with getting pregnant had damaged the marriage and driven him to seek comfort elsewhere, and I felt my whole body go cold listening to him blame me for the affair. The mediator, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses, looked up from her notes and said that wasn't how spousal support worked in cases of adultery and financial abuse. She pointed out that my husband had emptied our joint account, had an affair during my medical treatment, and got my sister pregnant while I was paying for IVF with our savings. My husband's face turned bright red and he started arguing that I'd made our whole marriage about babies and ignored his needs, but the mediator cut him off and said his behavior constituted grounds for denying any support request. I watched him grip the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white, and Tucker put a hand on his arm to shut him up before he made things worse. Julian wrote something on his legal pad, and I could see he was trying not to smile. We moved on to dividing assets and agreed to sell the house and split the money down the middle, which seemed simple until my husband tried to claim half the furniture that I'd brought into the marriage from my old apartment. He wanted my grandmother's dining table and the bookshelf I'd had since college, things that were clearly mine before we even met. Julian set down his pen and said, if we couldn't agree on a fair division of premarital property, he'd be happy to bring up every detail of the affair in court, including dates, locations, and the fact that my husband had sex with my sister in our marital bed. Tucker went pale and told my husband to stop being petty, and my husband finally agreed to take only the things we'd bought together just to end the whole process. The mediator drew up a property division agreement and we both signed it, and I felt nothing except tired. 3 days later, I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment using money my dad loaned me after I called him crying about having nowhere to go. The place was tiny and the carpet was old, and it smelled like the previous tenant had cats, but the lease was month to month and I could afford it with what was left in my personal account. My dad and Christopher helped me move my boxes and furniture from storage, and by evening I had an air mattress on the bedroom floor and some kitchen stuff unpacked. That first night alone, I lay on the air mattress staring at the ceiling and feeling both scared and free at the same time, because this space was mine and my husband had never been here, and that mattered more than comfort. I could hear my neighbors through the thin walls and sirens outside on the street, but I didn't care because I wasn't sharing a bed with someone who destroyed me. I fell asleep around 3 in the morning and woke up to my phone ringing 6 hours later. It was a number I didn't recognize, so I ignored it and made coffee in my new kitchen with boxes still stacked everywhere. 2 days after I moved in, Someone knocked on my apartment door around noon. I looked through the peephole and saw Katie standing in the hallway crying, and I backed away from the door without making a sound. She knocked again and called my name, begging me to please just talk to her for 5 minutes. I sat on my air mattress in the bedroom with my hands over my ears while she kept knocking and crying in the hall. An hour passed and she was still out there, and I texted Haley asking what to do. Haley said she was coming over right now and to not open the door no matter what. Katie's voice got more desperate and she started saying she was sorry over and over, that she knew she messed up but she loved him and couldn't help it. I heard Haley's voice in the hallway 20 minutes later telling Katie to leave immediately, or she was calling the police. Katie started screaming that I was punishing her for being in love, that I was cold and cruel and couldn't understand real feelings. Haley said she had her phone out and was dialing 911, and I finally heard Katie's footsteps going down the hall. Haley knocked and said it was her, and when I opened the door, she hugged me while I cried into her shoulder. My mom called that evening, and I almost didn't answer, but I figured I should get it over with. She started by saying she'd talked to Katie and heard about what happened at my apartment, and I should really consider forgiving my sister because family is forever. I told her Katie stopped being my family when she slept with my husband while I was going through IVF, and my mom gasped like I'd said something terrible. She said I was being cold and holding grudges, that Katie made a mistake, but she was still my sister and I was acting like she'd committed murder. I said betraying me during the hardest time of my life while carrying my husband's baby was pretty close to murder, and my mom started crying and saying I'd changed into someone mean. I hung up on her because I couldn't handle her making me the bad guy in this situation, and I turned off my phone for the rest of the night. My next session with Davina happened 3 days later, and I spent most of it crying about my mom taking Katie's side. Davina listened and then said I had every right to set boundaries with family members who hurt me, that I didn't owe anyone forgiveness just because we shared DNA. She explained that forgiveness isn't required for healing, that I could move forward with my life without ever speaking to Katie again if that's what I needed. We talked about how my mom was probably scared of losing both her daughters and was trying to fix things the only way she knew how, but that didn't make it okay for her to dismiss my pain. Davina said I got to decide who had access to me and my life, and choosing to cut off people who betrayed me wasn't cruel. It was self-protection. I left her office feeling like maybe I wasn't crazy for refusing to reconcile with Katie, that my anger was valid and I didn't have to get over it on anyone else's timeline. The divorce was finalized 3 months after I left, which Julian said was incredibly fast, but he'd pushed hard because of the clear evidence of adultery. I went to his office to sign the final papers and sat across from his desk feeling absolutely nothing except relief that it was over. Julian slid the documents across to me and showed me where to sign, and my hand shook a little as I wrote my name on the line that ended my marriage. He said I'd handled this with remarkable strength given the circumstances, and I told him I didn't feel strong at all, just like I was surviving one day at a time. Julian said that was what strength looked like sometimes, and he shook my hand and told me I was going to be okay, even if it didn't feel that way yet. I walked out of his office legally single and went back to my apartment and cried for 2 hours. The money from the house sale came through a week later, and I got my half deposited into my account, which was more money than I'd seen in years. I sat at my kitchen table looking at my bank balance and feeling sick, because I had to use most of it to pay off the IVF debt that was still hanging over me. The debt represented the baby I didn't get to have, the pregnancy I terminated, the future I'd destroyed my life trying to create. I transferred the money to pay off the medical bills, and watched my account drop back down to almost nothing, and then I called Haley crying. She came over with her laptop and helped me set up a budget with what was left, and we looked at job listings for second jobs I could work on weekends. I applied to 3 retail positions that night and tried not to think about how I was 32 years old starting over with nothing. 4 months after the divorce was final, my dad called me on a Tuesday morning before work. He said he needed to tell me something before I saw it on social media, and my stomach dropped because I knew what was coming. My husband had married Katie over the weekend in a small ceremony, and my dad wanted me to hear it from him instead of seeing wedding photos online. I thanked him for the warning and told him I loved him, and then I opened every social media app and blocked both of them on every platform I could find. I blocked their phone numbers and their email addresses, and anyone who might post pictures of them, and I felt nothing except a grim satisfaction that I'd never have to see their life together, or know when Katie got pregnant again. Haley texted asking if I was okay, and I said I was fine, which was almost true because I'd already grieved the loss of both of them. I started applying for new jobs 2 weeks later because too many people at my current workplace knew about my IVF journey and kept asking how I was doing with pitying looks. I got an offer from a different company doing similar work for slightly better pay, and I gave my 2 weeks' notice without explaining why I was leaving. My new coworkers didn't know anything about my past, didn't know I'd been married or tried to have a baby, or that my sister destroyed my life. The anonymity felt like a gift, even though I was lonely without work friends, because I could be someone new who wasn't defined by betrayal and loss. I sat at my new desk on my first day and realized no one here knew the old version of me, and maybe that was exactly what I needed to move forward. Davina's office had this clock on the wall that ticked really loudly, and I stared at it during our sessions when I couldn't figure out how to answer her questions. She asked me to describe myself without using the words wife or mother or infertile, and I sat there for 5 full minutes with my mouth open trying to think of something to say. She gave me a journal and told me to write one thing every day about who I was outside of those relationships, and I went home and stared at the blank page for an hour before writing, "I don't know," and closing it. The next week I brought the journal back and she flipped through the pages and every single day just said, "I don't know," in different handwriting depending on how frustrated I was when I wrote it. Davina didn't seem disappointed. Just asked me what I used to like before I got married and started trying to have a baby. I told her I used to read a lot and go hiking and cook complicated recipes just for fun. But all of that felt like it belonged to a different person who died 3 years ago. She said that person didn't die. She just got buried under grief and trauma, and maybe I could start with something small like reading 1 chapter of a book. I picked up a novel from the library on my way home and read 3 chapters that night and cried because I'd forgotten what it felt like to care about made-up people's problems instead of my own. Haley called me the next week and asked if I wanted to join her book club, and I almost said no because the idea of meeting new people made me want to hide in my apartment forever. But I thought about Davina telling me to try small things, so I said yes, and showed up at this woman's house with 7 other women I'd never met. They were talking about some romance novel and arguing about whether the main character should forgive her cheating boyfriend, and I sat there eating chips and dip and listening to them debate like it actually mattered. One woman said once a cheater, always a cheater, and another woman said, people can change and grow, and I wanted to scream that they were both wrong because some people cheat and then marry your sister. But I didn't say anything, just laughed when they made jokes about the bad sex scenes and ate more snacks than I should have. Walking back to my car afterward, I felt almost normal for the first time in months. Like maybe I could be a person who went to book club and had opinions about novels, and didn't think about my destroyed life every single second. I went back the next week and the week after that, and slowly learned their names and what they did for work, and none of them knew anything about my past, or looked at me with pity. I was just another woman who liked books and complained about her job and ate too many cookies, and that felt like the biggest gift anyone had given me in years. 3 weeks later, I was at the grocery store trying to decide between 2 types of pasta when someone said my name, and I turned around to see Serenity pushing a cart toward me. My stomach dropped because I didn't want to talk about anything related to Katie or my husband, but she was already walking over with this weird expression on her face. She asked how I was doing, and I said fine, and tried to move past her, but she touched my arm and said she thought I should know that Katie and my husband were having serious problems already. I told her I really didn't want to hear about them, and tried to walk away, but she kept talking, saying they fought constantly and blamed each other for everything, and Katie had called her crying multiple times. Part of me wanted to plug my ears and run away, but another part felt this cold satisfaction spreading through my chest, knowing their relationship wasn't the perfect love story they destroyed my life for. Serenity said Katie told her she'd made a huge mistake and wished she could take everything back, and I finally interrupted and said I didn't care what Katie wished, because it didn't change anything. I thanked Serenity for trying to update me, but told her I needed to move on, and that meant not knowing anything about their lives anymore. Then I walked to the checkout without buying anything because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the basket. I sat in my car in the parking lot and felt that grim satisfaction mixing with anger, because they got to blow up my entire world, and then act surprised when their affair didn't turn into a fairy tale. Haley called me that night about something else and mentioned that Christopher's coworker had been asking about me, and before I could think too hard about it, I said okay to her setting us up. 6 months had passed since my divorce was final, and I figured I should at least try to see if I could sit across from another man without wanting to run away. We met at a restaurant on a Tuesday night, and he was nice-looking and polite and asked normal questions about my job and hobbies. When he asked about my past relationships, I gave him the basic facts about being divorced, and he nodded sympathetically and said, "Divorce was hard." I could tell he wanted to know more, but I didn't offer details about affairs or sisters or terminated pregnancies, just said it had been a difficult time and I was still figuring things out. He talked about his own life and his job and his dog, and the conversation was fine, but I could feel myself holding back and being careful with every word. He walked me to my car at the end and said he'd had a nice time, and I said me too, and I could see in his face that he wasn't going to call again. The baggage was too obvious even though I tried to hide it, and I drove home feeling relieved and sad at the same time. Davina asked me the next week how the date went, and I told her about feeling like I was performing being normal instead of actually being normal. She asked what I wanted for my future regarding relationships and children, and I sat with that question for a long time before answering. I told her honestly that I didn't know if I could trust anyone enough to try again, that the idea of being vulnerable with another person felt impossible right now. She asked if that scared me, and I said no, that I was okay with being alone if that's what healing required, and maybe I'd feel differently later, but right now I needed to focus on myself. My dad called a few days later and invited me to dinner, just the 2 of us without my mom or Katie, and I met him at a restaurant near his house. We sat down and ordered food, and he asked about my job and my apartment, and actually listened to my answers instead of just waiting to talk. He told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything, and that took me by surprise because I didn't feel like I'd handled anything well. I told him I was just surviving day by day, and he said that was exactly what strength looked like, that I'd gotten up every morning and gone to work and built a new life when most people would have fallen apart. Then he said he regretted not standing up to my mom more when she tried to push me toward forgiving Katie, that he should have been clearer about supporting me and my choices. I felt tears starting and blinked them away because I didn't want to cry in the restaurant, and I told him it meant a lot that he was here now. We talked for 2 hours about normal things and difficult things, and by the end, I felt like I had at least one parent who understood me. My boss called me into her office 3 weeks later, and I thought I was in trouble, but instead she offered me a promotion with better pay and more responsibility. I accepted immediately and walked back to my desk feeling like maybe things were actually moving in the right direction for once. The extra money meant I could finally buy real furniture instead of living with my air mattress and folding chairs. So I spent a Saturday at furniture stores picking out a couch and a bed frame and a kitchen table. When everything was delivered and set up, my apartment looked like an actual home instead of a temporary hiding place, and I hung pictures on the walls and bought plants for the windowsill. Standing in my living room looking at the space I'd created just for myself, I felt something shift inside me like maybe I was building a life that was actually mine. A letter showed up in my mailbox the next week with Katie's handwriting on the envelope and a forwarding sticker from my old address. I stood there holding it and feeling my heart rate speed up, and I thought about opening it and reading whatever she had to say. But then I walked straight to the trash can and threw it away without breaking the seal because I genuinely didn't care what she wanted to tell me. I mentioned it to Davina at my next session, and she asked how I felt about not reading it, and I said I felt good about it, that I didn't owe Katie access to me just because she was family. Davina nodded and said that was exactly right, that sometimes people want forgiveness to make themselves feel better, and I had no obligation to give that to them. The validation made me feel stronger somehow, like I was making the right choices even when they were hard. Haley mentioned one day that the animal shelter near her house was always looking for weekend volunteers and asked if I'd be interested. I'd been feeling restless on Saturdays with too much time to think, so I signed up and went in for my first shift the next weekend. They put me in charge of walking the dogs and cleaning kennels and being around animals who just wanted attention, and treats without any complicated emotions felt like exactly what I needed. One of the older dogs, a lab mix named Cooper, followed me around the entire shift and sat by my feet whenever I stopped moving. The staff joked that he'd adopted me, and I laughed, but felt something warm in my chest when Cooper pressed his head against my leg. I started going every Saturday and Sunday, and Cooper was always waiting by his kennel door when I arrived, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. Haley came with me one weekend to see what I'd been doing and watched Cooper stick to my side the entire time. She said the shelter had been trying to find him a home for months, but he was older and not as cute as the puppies, so people passed him by. She suggested I consider actually adopting him since we'd clearly bonded, and the idea scared me because it felt like a huge commitment I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I thought about going home to my empty apartment, and realized I wanted Cooper there. Wanted to take care of something that needed me without all the pressure of human relationships. I filled out the application that day, and 2 weeks later, after they did a home visit and checked my references, I brought Cooper home. He walked into my apartment and sniffed every corner and then jumped on my new couch and curled up like he'd always lived there. I sat down next to him and scratched behind his ears, and my apartment felt less empty than it had since I moved in, like maybe I was building something real here after all. Cooper spent the first few weeks jumping at every loud noise and hiding under the bed whenever I left the room for more than 5 minutes. I started working with him on basic commands and building trust through consistent routines, feeding him at the same times every day, and taking him for walks on the same schedule. He'd flinch when I moved too fast or reach toward him suddenly, and I found myself moving slower and speaking softer to help him feel safe. Davina pointed out during one of our sessions that I was giving Cooper exactly what I needed myself: patience and consistency, and proof that someone would show up for him every single day. She said the fact that I could provide safety and love for him even while I was still healing myself showed how much strength I actually had, and I cried because I didn't feel strong at all most days. But Cooper was getting better, his tail wagging more often and his anxious pacing decreasing, and maybe that meant I was getting better too, even if I couldn't see it yet. My dad called one evening and said my mom wanted to talk to me if I was willing, and my whole body tensed up because I knew this conversation was coming eventually. I told him I'd meet her for coffee, but I had clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't discuss, and he said he understood and would set it up. 3 days later, I walked into a coffee shop across town and found my mom already sitting at a corner table looking nervous and older than I remembered. She stood up when she saw me and looked like she wanted to hug me, but I sat down across from her and kept my hands wrapped around my coffee cup. My mom started crying before she even said hello and told me she was sorry for not supporting me better when everything happened, that she was wrong to push me toward forgiving Katie so quickly. I listened without interrupting while she explained that she'd been trying to keep the family together and didn't realize how much that hurt me. And when she finished, I told her I appreciated the apology, but our relationship would never be what it was before. She nodded and wiped her eyes and said she understood, and I could see that she genuinely meant it, which made me feel slightly less angry. I told her I was willing to have a relationship with her, but I would never have contact with Katie again, and she needed to accept that this was permanent and not temporary. My mom started crying harder and said she hoped someday I might change my mind, and I cut her off and said no. This wasn't something that time would fix or that I would get over. She asked if she could tell me about Katie, and I said absolutely not, that I didn't want to hear her name or know anything about her life, and if my mom couldn't respect that boundary, then we couldn't have a relationship at all. My mom was quiet for a long time and then finally agreed to my terms, and we finished our coffee talking about safe topics like her garden and my new apartment. We started having monthly lunches after that at a restaurant halfway between our houses, and the conversations were awkward at first, but got easier as we found things to talk about that didn't involve Katie or my ex-husband. My mom asked about Cooper and my job and the book club, and I asked about my dad and her volunteer work at the library, and slowly we rebuilt something that looked like trust, even if it felt fragile. 1 year after my divorce was finalized, I sat in Davina's office and realized I was functioning in my daily life instead of just surviving it. I had work projects I cared about and friends I saw regularly, and Cooper who needed me every morning and night, and the constant crushing weight on my chest had lifted enough that I could breathe normally most days. Davina celebrated this milestone with me and pointed out all the ways I'd grown over the past year, how I'd learned to set boundaries and advocate for myself, and build a life that was actually mine. She asked what I was most proud of, and I thought about it and said probably the fact that I got out of bed every single day even when I didn't want to, that I kept showing up for myself when it would have been easier to give up. I told her I wasn't just surviving anymore, but actually building something new, and she smiled and said that was exactly what healing looked like, even if it didn't feel triumphant or dramatic. Someone from the book club invited me to a dinner party, and I met his friend who was recently divorced, and we ended up talking in the corner for most of the evening about complicated family situations and starting over. He asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, and I said yes, even though my stomach twisted with anxiety. And 2 days later, we met at a cafe, and I was more honest about my past than I'd been on my previous date. I told him about the IVF and the affair and the divorce, and instead of looking uncomfortable, he nodded and said his ex-wife had cheated on him with his business partner. We talked about trust issues and therapy and how hard it was to imagine being vulnerable with someone new, and when he walked me to my car, he said he'd like to see me again if I was interested. I told him I wasn't ready for anything serious yet, and he said that was fine. He wasn't either, and we started seeing each other casually every few weeks for dinner or movies. Haley called me one afternoon and asked if she could come over because she had something to tell me, and I knew from her voice what it was before she even said the words. She sat on my couch with tears in her eyes and told me she was pregnant, and I felt genuine happiness for her mixed with grief for what I'd lost, and somehow I could hold both feelings at once without falling apart. I hugged her and told her congratulations and offered to help with baby shopping, and she cried and said she'd been so worried about telling me because she didn't want to hurt me. I told her honestly that it did hurt, but I was also genuinely happy for her, and she deserved this joy, and I wanted to be part of it. Over the next few months, I helped Haley set up her nursery and pick out baby clothes and plan her baby shower, and it hurt every single time, but it was also healing to be part of this joy without it destroying me. I threw her baby shower at my apartment and watched her open tiny outfits and baby blankets, and I felt the grief sitting in my chest, but I also felt grateful that I could do this for my best friend. When Haley went into labor, Christopher called me from the hospital, and I drove over and sat in the waiting room for 6 hours until their baby girl arrived healthy and perfect. Haley asked me to come meet her, and I walked into that hospital room and saw her holding this tiny person, and she asked me to be the godmother, and I said yes, even though it scared me. Holding Haley's baby for the first time, I felt the weight of this small body in my arms, and the grief of what I'd lost hit me so hard I almost couldn't breathe. But I also felt gratitude for what I had now, for this friendship and this trust and this moment, and I realized these feelings could exist together without canceling each other out. I told Davina at my next session that I thought I was finally accepting that my life didn't turn out how I planned, but it was still worth living, and she said that was real healing, not the absence of pain, but the ability to live with it. My dad called one evening and told me that Katie and my ex-husband were getting divorced after only a year of marriage, and I felt absolutely nothing about this news except relief that I'd gotten out first. I didn't ask for details and told my dad I didn't care what happened between them, that their relationship wasn't my concern anymore and never would be. He said he understood, and that he was proud of how I'd built a new life for myself, and we talked about other things before hanging up. 2 years after everything fell apart, I was living in a bigger apartment with Cooper, and I had genuine friendships with people from work and book club and Haley's circle. My career was stable with a promotion that gave me financial security, and I was casually dating someone who respected my boundaries and didn't push for more than I could give. I wasn't where I thought I'd be at this age, without a husband or a baby or the family I'd imagined, but I was okay. Some days that felt like enough. I told Davina at my next session that I wanted to try spacing out our appointments because coming every week was starting to feel like a routine instead of something I needed. She smiled and said she'd been waiting for me to say that, and we agreed to move to monthly check-ins starting next month. I felt weird about it, like I was graduating from something but also worried I'd fall apart without the weekly safety net. Davina must have seen it on my face because she leaned forward and told me I'd done remarkable work, and that healing wasn't linear. She said I was allowed to have bad days without it meaning I'd failed, and I could always come back to weekly sessions if I needed to. I left her office feeling proud and scared at the same time, like I was stepping out into something unknown, but at least I was stepping. Cyrus took me to dinner that weekend at the Italian place we'd been to on our third date, and halfway through the meal he put down his fork and said he needed to tell me something. My stomach dropped because that phrase never meant anything good, but he reached across the table and took my hand. He told me he was falling for me and wanted to know if I could see a future together, and I felt panic rise in my chest because I didn't have a good answer. I pulled my hand back and told him honestly that I didn't know, but I was willing to try to. I watched his face to see if that would be enough or if he'd get up and leave. He sat back in his chair and said that was enough for now, and we could keep taking things slow while I worked through my trust issues. I felt relief wash over me that he wasn't demanding more than I could give, and we finished dinner talking about easier things like his coworkers' terrible dating stories. My dad called a few days later and asked if I'd come to dinner with him and my mom, and I almost said no, but something made me agree. I drove to their house on Sunday afternoon and sat at their dining room table feeling like a stranger in a place I used to know. The meal was awkward but civil, and I realized I'd built a version of family that worked for me even if it wasn't traditional. My mom asked about Cyrus and I told her a little, keeping it vague but honest, and she seemed genuinely happy that I was moving forward with my life. She didn't push for details or ask when we'd get serious, just said she was glad I'd found someone kind. I left feeling like maybe we could have some kind of relationship even if it would never be what it was before. On the anniversary of the day I found out about the affair, I woke up feeling heavy and decided to take Cooper to the park instead of staying home. We walked the trails for over an hour and I threw his ball until my arm got tired, and I sat on a bench watching him sniff around the trees. I thought about everything that had happened and realized I survived something I didn't think I could survive. I wasn't grateful for what happened, and I was still angry about what was stolen from me, the baby I'd wanted so badly and the marriage I thought I had. But I was here, and I was building a life that was mine, with Cooper and Cyrus and real friends, and a job I didn't hate. That was something. Maybe not everything I'd planned, but something real and solid that nobody could take away from me.